Now, another thing associated with the Obama administration was the 2014 coup in Ukraine. It's a bit complicated. Ukraine has been, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's been torn apart by rival oligarchs. Some were pro-Russian, some were pro-Western European Union. This is purely opportunistic. Most of these people would sell their mother for a buck, or they were connected to their own financial gain and their business interests. Okay, so Russia was the same way, only the system was consolidated under Putin. Okay, so in Ukraine, basically in 2014, a protest movement against a more pro-Western president who was elected, democratically elected. He wanted to have good relations with Russia, but also a deal with the European Union. There was a mass protest in Kiev. People had illusions in the European Union. The U.S. directly intervened and basically converted a protest movement into a coup using basically Nazi and neo-Nazi elements to overthrow the one oligarch in favor of another equally corrupt oligarch. And since then, it's been essentially a feeding frenzy. Ukraine is a potentially very wealthy country. Right now it has an economy the size of Pittsburgh. The country is the size of France. The economy is the size of Pittsburgh. It's potentially very wealthy. It's been looted by its own ruling class in cooperation with the U.S. Anyway, so it's been a feeding frenzy, and of course Hunter Biden, the son of Joe Biden, has been cashing in. He has no known background in the petroleum or natural gas industry. He was a cokehead. He was recently, before he was kicked out of the Navy reserves for cocaine use. A whole bunch of weird stories about him. Anyway, he got a job. He had no known background, no known expertise in the production, transport, or distribution of natural gas, or in the complex financial operations of such a business, and he was placed on the board of the largest gas company in Ukraine in April 2014, just a few months after, about, I believe, a month after the coup, and he was making $50,000 a month, currently a scandal. And the same goes for everyone. Nancy Pelosi's son had business interests in Ukraine, as well as a lot of Republicans. But the leaders and the sons and daughters was a feeding frenzy, essentially. It was open for looting. I should mention also Obama was the only Nobel Prize winner to bomb another Nobel Prize winner. I believe in 2014 also he bombed Afghanistan, Doctors Without Borders facility for young children. So it's the only case in the world of a Nobel Prize winner bombing another Nobel Prize winner. Bill Clinton, a few things about him. Of course, in 1994, he dramatically changed the welfare system in this country, quote, ended welfare as we know it. Again, an article from the World Socialist website. This was disastrous. Bill Clinton dramatically restricted welfare payments and the food stamp program, and according to the article, millions of poor people lost all cash assistance and were bereft of any income, while benefits were always woefully inadequate. Were replaced it in states currently in many states currently provide less than half the income deemed necessary by the government to avoid poverty. In 1/3 of states, the benefits are less than 20% of the official poverty level, and this law also cut food assistance to the poor and had a tightening of eligibility for food stamps that has had devastating consequences on many people. And as a result of the lowering of maximum benefits enacted at that time, a working household of 3 today, that is in 2018, receives nearly $400 less a year, or about $33 a month, than it would have received had the reform not been enacted. And again, it's had devastating consequences on many people, especially African American families. So draconian were Clinton's measures. They were actually denounced by Senator Patrick Moynihan. Moynihan was kind of an elder statesman in the Democratic Party, senator from New York. He actually was an early neoliberal, early proponent of privatization and austerity. He went all over the place. He was widely revived for joining the Nixon administration, actually. and he initiated the first efforts to cut back on social programs. But even Moynihan denounced both parties at the time, in the mid-90s, for making, quote, making cruelty to children an instrument of social policy. And he was an early neoliberal himself. Another thing that Bill Clinton is known for, will go down in history for, is mass incarceration. The New Jim Crow. There's a book The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, really a great book, describes how the system of mass incarceration evolved and what involves. And the Democrats were fully in part of what's called the carceral state. The U.S. now has per capita more people in jail than any other, believe any other country in the world, or maybe it's the third behind China and I think Russia and South Africa, or fourth. But by far more people are in jail, both per capita and proportional, compared to any other developed country in the world. So this crime bill, 1994 crime bill, imposed tougher prison sentences at the federal level and also encouraged states to do the same. It provided funds for states to build more prisons, aimed to fund 100,000 more cops, and back grant programs that encouraged police officers to carry out more drug-related arrests. It was a dramatic escalation of the war on drugs, and Biden was bragging after it passed, quote, that the liberal wing of the Democratic Party was now for 60 new death penalties, 70 enhanced penalties, 100,000 cops, and 125,000 new state prison cells, according to Joe Biden. Joe Biden wrote this law and was a big proponent of it. And this 1994 law was the biggest crime bill in the history of the United States. Now, it didn't start mass incarceration, which started around the time of the Nixon administration, maybe a bit earlier, but it was dramatically ramped up. And today in the U.S., 2.3 million people are incarcerated or in jail, which is a 500% increase over the past 40 years. And the U.S. is the world leader in incarceration. But not all Americans are incarcerated equally, as we know. Black men are nearly 6 times as likely to be incarcerated as white men. And federal courts impose prison sentences on black men that are, on the average, 19% longer than those imposed on similarly situated white men between 2011 and 2016, according to a report which the World Socialist website quotes. So it means for every 100,000 residents in the U.S., approximately 655 of them are behind bars, higher than any place in the world by far, and highest in the developed world. The bombing of Kosovo. So Bill Clinton had a militaristic foreign policy. Clinton and Gore dispatched troops around the world far more frequently than any other administration before launching the 1999 war against Yugoslavia. Bill Clinton sent U.S. forces into combat 46 times, and continued Bush's invasion of Somalia, also invaded Sudan, sent military troops to Sudan, Afghanistan, bombed Iraq almost continuously. In 1994, threatened a war against North Korea. There's a great counterpunch article, The Bullshit Bombing of Serbia by James Brevard, which came out in August 2019. According to this, 1,500 Serbian civilians were killed by NATO bombing in one of the biggest sham morality plays of the modern era. And the author quotes a British professor saying the 78-day bombing campaign was not a purely military operation. It was a so-called destroyed so-called dual-use targets, which were factories, city bridges, even the main television building in downtown Belgrade, in an attempt to really terrorize the population. And the author Brevard quotes Gail Shee biography of Hillary Clinton. Hillary wouldn't actually talk to Bill for 8 months after the Lewinsky scandal broke, only resumed talking to her husband when she phoned him and urged him in the, quote, strongest possible terms to begin bombing Serbia within 24 hours. And the late Alexander Cockburn in the LA Times says it's scarcely surprising that Hillary would have urged President Clinton to drop cluster bombs on the Serbs to defend our, quote, way of life. The First Lady is a social engineer. She believes in therapeutic policing and the duty of the state to impose such policing. War is more social engineering. Fixatory via high explosive, social therapy via cruise missile. As a tough therapeutic cop, she does not shy away from the most abrupt expression of the therapy, death penalty, the death penalty. And Kosovo, of course, helped rehabilitate U.S. Imperialism ideologically. There was a long period after the Vietnam War until 9/11, when it wasn't really U.S. troops overseas U.S. military presence overseas was very unpopular. People were skeptical about it, didn't want to engage in foreign wars. But Kosovo, the bombing of Kosovo, which was horrible, was, quote, humanitarian intervention and rehabilitated the idea of imperialism. Okay. Madeleine Albright was the Secretary of State under Bill Clinton. There's a really interesting story about her. She was a refugee. Her family was sort of refugees from the Holocaust. Her father was the Czech ambassador to Yugoslavia in the 30s, late 1930s, or early 1930s. And this was during the Nazi era. And so after the Nazi invasion of Czechoslovakia, she and her family were sort of refugees, and she lived in Belgrade for a while. And so anyway, later on, she was Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, and during the bombing of Belgrade, the daughter of the Czech ambassador, who was a girlhood friend during that period, actually wrote her a letter begging her to stop the bombing, and I don't know her reaction. She seems to have been a fairly bloodthirsty person herself. And there's a famous interview, Leslie Stahl on 60 Minutes, U.S. documentary TV show series, which I used to watch it. But anyway, okay, it was widely believed that due to Bill Clinton's sanctions on Iraq, that there was a horrific child mortality rate. One estimate was about 570,000, over 500,000 children. Recent research says that may not really be true. I'm a bit skeptical of the recent research, but it may have been disinformation from Saddam. But it was widely believed that 500,000 children were killed due to the UN sanctions, which were supported by Bill Clinton strongly, basically put in place by Bill Clinton. Okay, so Leslie Stahl interviewed Madeleine Albright in 60 Minutes, and very, very famous quote. She said to Albright, "We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And is the price worth it?" And Secretary of State Madeleine Albright replied, "I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it." That was on 60 Minutes, May 12th of 1996. So the quote at the time was not widely repeated. She calmly asserted that U.S. policy objectives were worth the sacrifice of 500,000 Arab children. And there was, at the time, kind of a media blackout. Few people in the U.S. knew about it, but it was widely quoted in the Arab world, in the Arab press and the Arab media. And it's been also cited in alternate news in the U.S., but few people really knew about it. At least up until 9/11, but everyone in the Middle East knows about it. And it was a recruitment tool for Al-Qaeda. Anyway, another thing Bill Clinton was known for is deregulation. Glass-Steagall, which was a financial regulation bill passed in the 1930s. It was overturned in 1999 and led to an orgy of speculative investing, one of the things that contributed to the 2008 crash. And from the Lance Selfa book, really big thing in the Clinton administration was the Telecommunications Act of 1996, one of the main legislative achievements Clinton claimed that year. And it was passed with little public debate at the time. It took down barriers of ownership between major media, radio, phone, internet, launched, quote, a bacchanalia of media mergers and industry consolidation. And the decade following the act's passage, cable TV rates jumped by almost 50%, Local phone charges jumped by 20%, and under this act, the government gave licenses basically gave to broadcasters for free digital TV licenses that at the time were valued at $70 billion for free. And all this was for a total industry investment in the Democratic Party of only $309 million. That was their campaign contributions. So at the head of this gravy train was Bill Clinton himself, who bounced back from the 1994 loss of Congress to the Republican Party to win easy re-election. In the end, the best kept secret of the 1996 election, according to Lance Salva, is that more than any other single bloc, it was the telecommunications industry that rescued Bill Clinton. This is a staggeringly profitable sector, and Lance Salva goes on to describe interlocking ties between this industry and the Democratic Party, including Howard Dean's campaign, who is supposedly an insurgent, former governor of Vermont, elder statesman in the Democratic Party, had this insurgent campaign in 2004, under the mistaken impression that he was an anti-war candidate, which he actually wasn't. And also in the Clinton administration, now as a result of this Telecommunications Act, now there was a series of media mergers, and today there's a very high concentration of U.S. media ownership. As of 2019, 90% of the United States media is controlled by 5 media conglomerates. They are Comcast via NBC Universal, Disney, Viacom, and CBS. And Viacom and CBS are both controlled by National Amusements and AT&T via Time Warner. So essentially, it's really three companies own all these other media outlets. 90% of other media outlets. Essentially, the media is owned by billionaires. We don't have a free press at all. I mean, what they teach you in high school civics class. The media, U.S. media, is very tightly controlled. They're very much on message. Very little criticism is allowed, like as U.S. role in Syria or U.S. role in Iran. Very little real criticism. Everything is very tightly controlled. And it's resulting from the Clinton era. And back to Jimmy Carter, who was has an image today of being a really nice guy, and he's done some good things, but as president, he was fully on board with neoliberalism. He largely began a lot of this. First began widespread. He was militarily very aggressive. The U.S. was involved in Central America. He invoked the anti-labor Taft-Hartley Act in 1979 to break a miners' strike at the time. And Thatcher continued this a bit later. This was the beginning of what Reagan did a little while later. Reagan just continued what Carter began. And it goes back to Harry Truman, beginning of ramping up the Cold War, famous NSC 68, which basically created the situation we're in now, way back. Okay, so I think we've established how bad recent Democratic presidents were, and of course this means I have no support for Republicans either. Both are thoroughly corporate-run parties, but the Democrats are far more insidious, far worse, far more dangerous. So there's the Lance Salva book from a book review. This book debunks the notion that the Democratic Party, which I referenced the Lance Salva book earlier, this book debunks the notion that the Democratic Party is a progressive force. And the reviewer quotes Noam Chomsky as saying, if you stop focusing easily on the obviously bad Republicans and look closely at the history of what the Democrats have done, it's scary. This is one of the most empowering and important books every American could ever read. And it's, wow. And a structure of the Democratic Party, I got this from several sources, Lance Salva and several other people. First, there's very little accountability in the Democratic Party. It's one of the largest parties in the world. It's different in many ways from most of the other world's political parties. First, the Democrats have no fixed membership or membership requirements, really, no fixed statement of principles or program. And it's not a membership-based organization or a mass party. Basically, if you check a box once every 2 years or a year, whatever it is, and you're registered as a Democrat, you're a Democrat. There are no meetings for people. There are no public meetings, no real involvement for average people. It's deliberately designed that way. It's not a membership based party. What it essentially is a network of wealthy donors, millionaires and billionaires, and career politicians. Essentially, it's an electoral machine. And Lance Sullivan mentions how an alternative in the early 1900s, the socialist parties in Europe and the US were mass-based parties. There were hundreds and thousands of people. There were local meetings. There were open pub debates on party policy. There were newspapers and journals. There were visible and accountable party structures, and there was mass popular involvement. None of these exist in the Democratic Party. It's on purpose. It's a closed corporation. There are some dues-paying Democratic Party members. Yes, there are. I don't know how many exactly. They're connected to usually career politicians or people whose career is closely connected to the Democratic Party, consulting agencies, fundraising companies. They do pay dues to the Democratic Party. It's more a type of fundraising for politicians, basically. And the Democratic Party also has a layer of NGOs like nonprofits, fundraising firms, media outlets, which are kind of an unofficial part of the Democratic Party, but there's no real accountability there. Media, which is tightly aligned with the party, which of course is CNN, MSNBC. Friends of mine call it MSDNC or even MSNBCIA. This is totally on board with the intelligence community. The Daily Kos, the New York Times is aligned with the Democratic Party. Washington Post, the Nation, Mother Jones, and so on. They're essentially Democratic Party outlets. So the standard high school civics class view of a party, learn in high school, is that it's a quote, collective group of people organized to get what they couldn't get individually. And Lance Sullivan quotes a political scientist, Marisa Duverger, that he calls the Democratic Party a cadre caucus party of notables and a vestige of pre-20th century forms, basically a small group of notables, which are prominent people, usually businessmen and politicians, hire activists to perform the functions of a party. They get out the vote, distribute patronage. They're not at all interested in expanding democracy. They're not interested in expanding democracy, and the voters and the constituents are passive subjects. The cadre are more motivated by career advancement than ideology or political program. So the Democratic Party, in this view, is a ramshackle operation, but it does fulfill the views of its top donors. And the party platform basically reflects the prevailing winds, which is the platform of the candidate. And both U.S. parties reflect economic interests. The Democrats are right now close to what's called the fire section of the economy: finance, insurance, and real estate. Although the insurance industry is also partly Republican, and parts of Silicon Valley are close to the party. And of course the telecommunications industry, much of the media, the intelligence community right now is close to the Democratic Party. The Republicans are petroleum industry, the military-industrial complex, much of manufacturing is traditionally more closer to the Republicans. But of course, corporate America is totally okay with either party. And the World Socialist website has had a series of articles on what they call the CIA Democrats, and it says, one of these articles, an extraordinary number of former intelligence and military operatives from the CIA, the Pentagon, National Security Council, and the State Department are seeking nomination as Democratic candidates for Congress in the 2018 midterm elections. The potential influence of military-industrial personnel into the legislature has no precedent in U.S. political history. If the Democrats capture a majority in the House of Representatives on November 6th, as widely predicted, candidates drawn from the military-industrial apparatus will comprise as many as half of the new Democratic members of Congress. They will hold the balance of power in the lower chamber of Congress. Freudian slip there. Both push and pull are at work here, the article goes on to say. Democratic Party leaders are actively recruiting candidates with a military or industrial background for competitive seats when there's the best chance of ousting an incumbent Republican or fulfilling a vacancy, frequently clearing the field for a favored star recruit. They push aside other candidates for these CIA Democrats. And the Democratic leaders are promoting CIA agents and Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans. At the same time, such people are choosing the Democratic Party as their preferred political vehicle. There are far more former spies and soldiers seeking the nomination of the Democratic Party than of the Republican Party. There are so many that there's a subset of Democratic primary campaigns that, with a nod to Mod magazine, one might call it spy versus spy. And the article mentions, as a case in point, Alyssa Slotkin, a former CIA operative with 3 tours in Iraq, who worked as Iraq director for the National Security Council in the Obama White House, and as a top aide to John Negroponte, the first director of national intelligence. After her deep involvement in U.S. war crimes in Iraq, the article goes on to say, Slotkin moved to the Pentagon, where, as a principal deputy assistant secretary of defense for international security affairs, her areas of responsibility included drone warfare, quote, homeland defense, and cyber warfare. She now serves as the U.S. representative from Michigan's, she was elected, and she now serves, the article doesn't say this, but she's now the U.S. representative from Michigan's 8th congressional district. And so the CIA is inserting people into the Democratic Party, into political positions, and we don't really know what's going on, but it doesn't look good. That's all I can say at this point. And the article also appears to be very well documented. There's a section how this article was prepared, and it's citing publications from primary source material. And also, I'm a socialist, obviously. I'm quoting from several different organizations and myself, and it doesn't mean I necessarily fully agree with these organizations. I disagree with the some things about the World Socialist website. It's put out by the Socialist Equality Party. They're anti-union, and a few things I really don't agree with, but some of their stuff is good. Okay, talking about CIA Democrats, Pete Buttigieg. We don't know if he was in the CIA, but his career does seem a bit odd. He was promoted from out of nowhere. He's basically a mayor of South Bend, Indiana. Not a particularly popular mayor. It's a struggling Rust Belt city, really. Notre Dame is located there. It's the only thing it's known for, really. And he ran for president without all that much experience, and he was promoted from out of nowhere. There are several puff piece articles in the New York Times and Washington Post, and we know he was in Navy intelligence. He was in Bagram, Afghanistan, which is known for torture, and he taught himself Norwegian, which sounds good, but it's pretty common practice in the CIA, language training. And Buttigieg is very quiet about what he actually wants to do because he knows it's going to be unpopular. He probably wants to be vice president. It's unclear what's going on. Okay, so here we go. Now I talked about there was also Operation Mockingbird. We don't know a lot about it. It's an alleged program to manipulate the media. There was a congressional investigation. It's officially banned, but I'm not too surprised. If at some level the CIA is still doing it. Some of the early WikiLeaks revelations that came out described the CIA planting articles in the media of France and Germany to try to sway opinion in favor of the U.S. war in Afghanistan. And I'm not surprised that the CIA does it in this country as well, though it's officially illegal. Now, back to this Venn diagram. There are some differences in the party. They have different audiences in the parties, Republicans and Democrats. They have different audiences and different dynamics. They have different constituencies. For example, the Republicans their constituency are like small business people, petty bourgeois, white people in suburbs, the South, ranchers, small business people, white with so-called white working class that the Democratic Party sort of officially gave up on. There's a documentation that they officially gave up on the white working class. And also, African Americans, Hispanics, urban people, some white working class unions are officially the progressive constituency, or the constituency of the Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party is maybe a progressive constituency, but they're certainly not progressive themselves. They're not a progressive party. So this leads to their basic dynamic. The Republicans can give their extremists free range, shouting USA, USA, letting their lunatic fringe go off the leash at the Tea Party. And their extremists, their hardliners, can achieve political power. Well, the Democrats have the opposite dynamic. They're compromising, they reach across the aisle, they're so conciliatory. Basically, their role is to dampen down struggle, because the interest of their constituents, if taken further, could bring into question the power of the ruling class. So the Democrats' constituency is to rein in struggle. The Republicans, their lunatic fringe is not a threat to the system, really. It reinforces corporate power, basically. Although there's some resentment here and there. Yes, there's some resentment, but they're not a threat. While the Democrats' constituency, their demands could threaten corporate power, so their role is to rein it in. The Democrats' role is to co-opt and marginalize progressive movements, and they're very good at this. Okay, there's a Salon article which goes on. I'm going to quote part of it. It says, "I'm not just talking about the party's," according to this article, "so I'm also not just talking about the party's steadfast refusal to adopt coherent, progressive, and popular positions on issues like healthcare, gun control, marijuana legalization, and electoral reform. It's important to grasp why Democrats in power don't embrace these things, as opposed to embracing them on the campaign trail, which really doesn't count. Because the reasons go well beyond ideological confusion or political cowardice into deeper, darker places." Yeah, they don't want to offend their corporate donors. And the article hints that they don't want to offend their corporate paymasters. And it goes on to say that over the past 40 years, the Democrats have become an increasingly awkward coalition of affluent, cosmopolitan whites and urban people of color, and have largely abandoned their previous mistrust of corporate power, Wall Street, and big capital in general. Go down the list of powerful congressional Democrats, especially the committee chairs and members of leadership, and pay attention to where and how they raise money and who their major donors are. The corruption is widespread and deeply rooted, and it cannot be dislodged simply by anointing a reformer or a socialist as the presidential nominee. If anything, that should be the end point of a renovation or redemption project that has not happened. I disagree that there can be a renovation project in the Democratic Party. It cannot be reformed and has to be abandoned. And so, back to this Venn diagram, the LGBT rights. Now, it's not mentioned on the diagram. Democrats took credit for, there have been gains in LGBT rights under the Obama administration. Then the Democrats took credit for it, but keep in mind that both Bill Clinton opposed same-sex marriage. He passed DOMA, Defense of Marriage Act, which enabled the state not to recognize a marriage in another state, and don't ask, don't tell. And Obama and Hillary Clinton actually opposed same-sex marriage basically as long as they could. It was only after a generation of activists and probably better representation in the media that there was a sea change in attitudes towards LGBT people in the U.S. And after opinion polls safely saw that over 50% of Americans supported same-sex marriage, Obama suddenly supported it. The Democrats took no risks, no political risks on this at all. And now they're taking credit for it. And they do have a different constituency, so they move in slightly different directions, but they're not, they're mostly holding back that constituency. And the political scientist Sheldon Wolin called the Democrats an inauthentic opposition party, and he describes how the politics of lesser evilism has moved the debate further and further to the right. And also an interesting take from another Goodreads review of the Lance Selfa book on the role of the Democrats. The Democratic Party doesn't try, this is really well written, I think, the Democratic Party doesn't try to represent the cool groups. It wants to, quote, corral them and to ensure they don't strike out on an independent political path. The leaders of Unite for Peace and Justice were doing hip-hop, anti-war work, but then sold out to the Democrats by endorsing 2008 candidates who clearly weren't anti-war. The death of the anti-war movement during 2000-2009 is attributed to, Lance, to the selling out of the UNPJ to the Democrats. And I was involved, I saw this firsthand actually. I was involved in anti-war activism in the Boston area around 2004, a little bit later, and 2007, and I saw this happen. I saw the insidious role of nonprofits or activist organizations which were aligned with the Democratic Party. This actually includes the Communist Party, CPUSA, which, believe it or not, is effectively also very much a part of the Democratic Party today. And I saw them sabotage it. Well, we have to call off marches. We can't protest against it. We have to get Obama elected. And Obama killed the anti-war movement. And Obama was not an anti-war president. The war continued for quite a while later. It's still going on. Obama, as I mentioned, expanded the war to 7 other countries. And the Democratic Party expects movement leaders to rein in their movements, thereby undercutting the potential for struggle from below. The party leaders do not want street demonstrations. The rabble are not to get involved. The Democratic Party's top energies go to keeping a genuine mass opposition from developing. Sheldon Wolin said, by ignoring dissent and by assuming that the dissenters have no alternative, the party serves an important, if ironical, stabilizing function and in effect marginalizes any possible threat to the corporate allies of the Republicans. And Pat Moynihan again, Lance Selfa quoted Pat Moynihan as saying, it doesn't matter so much who wins. The important thing is the legitimacy of the system. Very true. And from the Lance Selfa's book, there's a very interesting paragraph. I'm going to read part of it. He starts off as saying, many sincere activists work in liberal organizations and unions on behalf of their members. But in the liberal universe, these organizations are part of an instrument of control that ensures that the political demands they raise are never too far from what the Democratic politicians view as acceptable. More often than not, these organizations become transmission belts for Democratic Party talking points, and you can see that in social media all the time. And he cites an example of the election after the 2000 election was stolen in Florida. Jesse Jackson threatened to lead mass protests of African Americans in Florida, and the DNC told him to back off, leaving the way clear for mobs of Republican staffers who were flown down to intimidate voters. And that's a perfect example. The Democrats rein in struggle while the Republicans have their supporters rampaging. And he uses a quote from the political scientist Thomas Harrison, said the Democrats' fear of in relation to Florida, the Democrats' fear of disruptive protests was consistent with the overall conservatism and defeatism displayed in this 2000 election, and particularly since the Reagan era, has become the party's distinguishing feature. The party leaders do not want street demonstrations, nor do they want to give the world the impression that American democracy runs with, quotation marks on democracy runs with anything less than clockwork precision. Therefore, the rabble are not to get involved. Everything must be done through the proper channels. In a mature democracy such as ours, the proper function of ordinary citizens is to vote and go home and leave the really important business of the nation, keeping down the standard of living, aka preventing the economy from overheating, which is the phrase they used. If the economy was too prosperous, there's a potential of inflation. They deliberately created more unemployment, or policing the world and creating optimal conditions for capital accumulations. Leave this to their betters. it is crucial that this business be carried out with as little fuss as possible. And that's the role of the Democratic Party. And also, speaking of the 2000 election, there's a myth of Ralph Nader through the election. The Democrats endlessly repeat this. It can be refuted. In Florida, more people actually voted for Patrick Buchanan than voted for Nader, and more people didn't vote. Also, there were large numbers of Jewish retirees who were presumably liberal who ended up voting for Buchanan, which sounds bizarre. And there's allegations of blatant vote tampering, massive vote rigging, and the Democrats, of course, helped block any investigation into this. So the Democrats, they really betray their own supporters, but they have intense hostility to anyone to their left, and they hate independent left politics. You leave this like bitterness against Ralph Nader, Jill Stein, anyone who runs to the left of them. They really reserve most of their hatred for these elements. And Mark Provost is a Boston area journalist. I believe he recently moved to Mexico. And he has a very interesting he had a Facebook post, and I'm paraphrasing this. And I hope I got Woody's intentions right. If you are Mark Provost, don't be too upset at me. Just let me know. But I think I got his meaning. I paraphrased it, but I hope I kept his meaning here. He says, many people I respect have bought into the idea that they are taking over the Democratic Party. So let me offer a few scenes of Democratic leadership from this past week. This was about 2 months ago. On health care, Nancy Pelosi says our current health care system is the best we can hope for, and we need to, quote, preserve private health insurers which provide health care to 100 million people. They actually don't. Pelosi's timing couldn't be worse, as GM management just retaliated against striking workers by arbitrarily revoking health insurance from thousands of union workers. Pelosi essentially believes you only have a right to health care if your boss agrees with it, and that's how it should stay. On to Dick Durbin, another Senate Democrat, who admonished their base this week and said, get real about impeaching Kavanaugh, famous Supreme Court justice who was guilty of sexual assault, or even investigating the latest sexual assault allegations. Democrats want to hold the fear of a conservative SCOTUS Supreme Court over voters' heads during an election, but when a seat was stolen by a serial rapist who openly lied under oath, there is zero accountability. And Provost goes on to say that, take note that when the Democratic base is energized, the Democrats say, get real. And when the base isn't fully on board yet, the Dems point to that base as an excuse to do nothing. Brave leadership. And today, Chuck Schumer says the Senate will never introduce an assault weapons ban because no one wants it and, quote, no one is with Beto. I could go on, but I gotta eat some breakfast. The Democratic Party isn't worth a single piece of dog shit. They don't care what their base wants. In fact, demobilizing their base is a top priority for Democratic leadership. I think this is true. They don't want protests, nor do they want demands. Inside the top, Democrats are still seething over the nationwide protest against Kavanaugh during his confirmation, even though that public anger helped them win back the House. Under the current leadership, Green New Deal, a national $15 minimum wage, and Medicare for all are nothing more than shiny lures to trick progressives and leftists into supporting a party that wants their vote without a promise of anything in return. This is very true. And okay, this can be continued, the betrayals of the Democrat we can trace this to local politics as well. There are campaigns to raise the minimum wage, which started a few years ago. SEIU, Unite Here, the Fight for 15. And then other socialist groups revived this movement a little while later, the 50 Now movement, which I was involved in. And then some cities and municipalities, Seattle, other places, began raising the minimum wage. But locally, you could see the Democrats were trying to water this down as much as possible. Even I have an article on this on my blog in Maine, how the local Democrats were trying to talk it down. They were close to business interest, restaurants, resort industry. They were trying to talk down the raise of the minimum wage as much as possible. There's a great YouTube video, Shama Sawant, was a socialist, is a socialist in the Seattle City Council. She led a movement to raise the minimum wage, and there's a really stormy council meeting. It's on YouTube, where the Democrats are trying to talk it down as much as possible. And also Colorado. Bernie Sanders, fracking is getting to be a big problem in Colorado, contaminating water supply, with the water supply really having horrible effects. And Jared Polis, the governor, is pro-fracking. Bernie Sanders campaigned for him, by the way, and his group Our Revolution helped him with campaign funds. And the local Democrats, many of them in Colorado, campaigned as anti-fracking. They pretended to be anti-fracking, and when they got in, they made a pivot. The socialist activist I know has analyzed this. And okay, so now the history of the Democratic Party. Now, I'm morphing off a couple things. Interesting article by August Nimitz, an African-American scholar, on the Monthly Review. I'll post the link. It's worth reading, and also some of this from the Lance Selfa book. Okay, so August Nimitz discusses how at every stage of mass rebellion, from the Jeffersonian period, populist era, the New Deal, and Great Society periods, the party domesticated struggle from below and headed off, sometimes just barely, its tendency toward new mass parties free from capitalist control. And the Democratic Party basically emerged under Andrew Jackson in 1830. This was a time of a lot of populist unrest. There was what's called the Panic of 1819, a depression. A lot of farmers went out of business, small businesses collapsed, things like that. It was widely blamed on the tight credit policies of the U.S. Central Bank. At the time, the U.S. had a central bank. It's called the Bank of the United States. It was very controversial, very unpopular. It was thought that this bank and the government in general was propping up the interest of wealthy people, wealthy corporations, and there was rebellion of small artisans, small business people from below. It was also what they call the corrupt bargain of 1824, when Andrew Jackson ran against John Quincy Adams. It was largely regarded as an illegitimate election. So there's also, again, dislike of bankers, a movement for a 10-hour workday, a lot of ferment support for the little guy. Movement for direct mail, universal mail suffrage, direct election of senators, things like that. So the Democratic Party developed very rapidly as a cross-class party, like artisans, workers, alliance with slave owners. So Andrew Jackson himself was not a nice guy, as we know. He was in charge of Indian removal. The Cherokee people were dispossessed from their homeland in Georgia, Tennessee, that region, pushed out to what's now Oklahoma. The famous Trail of Tears. He was actually at war against the Seminole people in Florida. He was not a nice guy. Now he's really bad reputation, but he was one of the head honchos, early founders, essentially, of the Democratic Party. And the writer Noel Ignatieff talks about how the U.S. developed class struggle developed within the context of the U.S. as what he called a Herrenvolk state, a master race state. Essentially, there was class struggle, but among white factions, it was understood that black people and Native Americans would be an oppressed underclass. They had no role in this, really. Like South Africa, essentially, some similar dynamic. So, as Nimitz says, the core of the Democratic Party remained the Southern slave-holding aristocracy that both Thomas Jefferson and James Madison embodied. So it represented no real direct economic. So these things which people were agitating for represent no real direct economic threat to the planters. So during the Jacksonian period, the planters put on their best democratic garb in the North. So the early Democratic Party was a little bit about equality, but for whites only. Democrats controlled the Supreme Court during the 1857 super racist Dred Scott verdict. If you liked slavery, you voted Democrat. And the party of the people was also once the party of slavery and the party of the Klan. And it was also the party of the Confederacy. The Confederacy during the Civil War didn't have parties, didn't have political parties, but the leaders came out of the Democratic Party. And there were also, during the Civil War, there was a split in the Democratic Party, but many Northern Democrats were pro-Southern, pro-Confederate. There was the Copperheads and the Indiana Butternuts, and some other groups were very pro-Confederate, so-called Peace Democrats. And of course, in the 1850s or in the pre-war era, it was inconceivable that abolitionists would work with the Democrats. And during the Reconstruction period, the Democrats, of course, were the party of Jim Crow, of the plantation owners, and the Klan, the KKK, was considered the armed wing of the Democratic Party. Now, both August Nimitz and Lance Self talk about the Populist Party. It was a movement that began in 1891. It was the Populist Party. It was an alliance emerged as an alliance in the southern states between poor whites and poor black farmers, we call small farmers and petty bourgeois forces, to reform capitalism. It rapidly grew owing to the increasing number of those victimized by the system's inherently rapacious character, especially after the Depression of 1893 hit. The 1890s was a period of on and off depression, and is a union of poor white farmers, black farmers. The Democratic, and it was on the Lance Self said, it was on the verge of transforming national politics. The Democrats made sure that didn't happen. They cut across it. They put up 1896, William Jennings Bryan, famous orator, he ran, Democratic Party candidate, and he cut across, he appealed to the base of the Populist Party. And he himself was sort of one-dimensional, had blamed the gold standard, famous speech about a cross of gold. He didn't have a broader critique, and he appealed to the base, and kind of the leadership, kind of the Populist Party went with it, and as a result, the Populist Party was essentially destroyed. It continued for a little while later, but it was essentially dead. The Democrats took the sail out, took the winds out of its sail, and the Populist People's Party was absorbed by the Democratic Party, and racism played a role in this. The cross-racial alliance between poor whites and poor blacks was broken, was smashed. One leading Populist Party politician, Tom Watson, was originally a proponent of this unity, poor whites and poor blacks. He switched sides, became a racist, became anti-Semitic, and really played a role in smashing the party and reviving the Democratic Party. And we have the effects of it to this day. Several generations of Southern politicians came out of that. And Lance Self again remarks how this movement was on the brink of remaking American politics when it was destroyed. Another thing from that era, a little bit later, the Wilmington municipal coup of 1898. Now, Wilmington is a town in North Carolina. It's a coastal town, kind of a college town, also a resort beach town. It's I was there this past spring. Nice town. It's it had at the time it was the last of the southern towns to be ruled by black people after Reconstruction. Reconstruction era had collapsed earlier, had fallen apart. So it still had the fusion government, that is, Populist Party with Republicans in a fusion government, and it was broken. It was actually literally a municipal coup, using the white business leaders, using the Klan, and rampaging, like basically a riot of rampaging white people, literally overthrew the government, literally a coup d'etat, overthrew the town government and replaced it with a white supremacist government. And the state of North Carolina just let it happen. The president let it happen. The federal government completely let it happen. And this, again, the Democratic Party was solidly a part of this. Was the Klan, again, was the armed wing of the Democratic Party. So Woodrow Wilson, by the way, next Democrat, he was a liberal hero to this day, Democratic president. He ambiguous liberal hero. He's like talk about Wilsonian idealism. There's the Woodrow Wilson Center for Peace Studies or whatever. He, I think, was a horrible guy. He basically, part of his campaign platform was against U.S. entry into World War I, which was very unpopular. He brought the U.S. into World War I, and it was an unpopular war. There was his administration began first mass propaganda, mass manipulation of the media. Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman in the book Manufacture of Consent called that manufacture of consent. The Creel Commission was developed for state propaganda. Also, his administration deported leftists. His administration was very racist, segregated or resegregated the federal government. He made a couple really incendiary statements saying that black troops returning from Europe after World War I were bringing the seeds of Bolshevism and whipped up racism. So there was in 1919, the summer, there's what they call the Red Summer of 1919. There were a series of called race riots. At least 30 American cities, maybe more. There were basically mobs of white people would devastate black areas, burn, loot, kill. At least 1,000 people were killed, probably a lot more. We don't really know. There were areas of a couple decades after slavery, there were some areas of black prosperity. Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was destroyed. It was burnt down. In fact, it was bombed from the air. The Oklahoma National Guard bombed it from the air. Nobody knows why. It was pretty horrific. And this happened in cities such as Tulsa, Omaha, Norfolk, Virginia, Knoxville, Tennessee, New York City, Chicago, at least 50 cities. And pretty prosperous black areas were destroyed. And I don't know to what extent Wilson was directly implicated in it, but he didn't do anything to stop it. He was well-known. And August Nimitz goes on to say that Democrat and known racist Woodrow Wilson sends the Marines to Mexico, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Panama, Honduras, and Guatemala. Then he forces the U.S. into World War I, which he promised not to do. And then, because he hadn't been a liberal asshole enough already, imprisoned anyone who complained in private about it. Actually, this is from a book review of the Lion Selfa book on Goodreads. And the review goes on to say, there's a great quote by Democrat Woodrow Wilson, "Colonies must be obtained or planted in order that no useful corner of the world may be overlooked or left unused." And this isn't a Republican talking, this isn't Trump talking, this is a Democratic president who, aside from Debs, Jane Addams, and Bourne, got a total free pass from the sold-out intelligentsia. And so he's a bit embarrassed. He's a liberal hero, but also a bit embarrassing. And FDR, of course, is the great messiah. He was definitely, Franklin Roosevelt was not a socialist by any means. The only reason he enacted the New Deal reforms, which were good, was because there were large independent socialist and communist parties in the U.S. In fact, he originally started as a deficit hawk. There's a story that he met with Herbert Hoover before he entered the White House, and Hoover was horrified at how heartless he thought FDR was. FDR believed in a total balanced budget. He quickly changed. Again. There was independent socialist and communist parties. In 1934, there were a series of epic strikes, Ohio, Minnesota, elsewhere. There are some places where workers were occupying factories. That's one step away from actually taking them over. And keep in mind, this is only 20 years after the Russian Revolution, which terrified much of the ruling class in the U.S. So FDR was not a socialist. It's widely repeated that a lot of business people, the business class, hated FDR, and that's largely true. But Lance Selfa describes how there was a group of very far-sighted businessmen who definitely gave him his ideas. They understood what he was doing. He was saving their system for them. He sabotaged any elements of socialism, by the way. There's Epic, Upton Sinclair, the writer Upton Sinclair had the Epic program, End Poverty in California, and FDR sabotaged it. There's several other things like that. There's also a million Mexicans. It's widely known how FDR deported Japanese Americans during the Second World War. Not as well known that he deported Mexican Americans, actually a million. Over a million, who were U.S. citizens, by the way. It was ethnic cleansing. It started under Herbert Hoover as a federal program, a municipal program. Started under Hoover, FDR continued this at least for the first year of his presidency. Then he ended federal involvement in these mass deportations, but allowed municipalities like LA or other cities to continue doing this. So pretty horrible. Most people don't know this about him. It was a very traumatic experience for many of these people caught up in this. If you read there's some accounts online of this. And black people were also discriminated against in New Deal programs. The CCC, for Civilian Conservation Corps, was carefully calibrated for local political gain, particularly in some southern states, just to get the Democrats elected. Then they'd end funding. FDR refused to support anti-lynching laws, and there was again epidemic of lynching continued. Refused to support any anti-lynching laws, things like that. So, and of course, then we got Harry Truman, the massive ramp up of Cold War militarism. I do think there were other directions the world could have gone into. And Lyndon Johnson, who lied about the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was a made-up incident to get the U.S. involved in the Vietnam War. August Nimitz mentions, did you know Johnson wrote well before, wrote the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, wrote it well before and waited for the right time to spring it? In late 1963, LBJ told the Joint Chiefs of Staff, just get me elected and then you can have your war. He had planned it out. Clearly, LBJ had no moral qualms about defoliating jungles and crops with Agent Orange and napalm and killing Asians for the crime of wanting to fight their own civil war without foreign interference. In fact, many have noted that LBJ actually carried out Goldwater's policy. And, August Nimitz mentions how Democratic Jimmy Carter reinstituted the draft in 1979. Let's thank him for that. Democrat Jimmy Carter reinstituted the draft in 1979. Let's thank him for that. Clinton sent armed forces into combat situations 46 times, as compared to only 26 times for Presidents Ford, Carter, Reagan, and H.W. Bush combined. Bill Clinton was a Democrat and a war criminal, but it's okay because he was charming, just like Democratic war criminal Obama. The power of the U.S. presidency is cumulative. Once one chief executive seizes power for himself, his predecessors will not give it up willingly. What liberals and Democrats consider to be heinous and extreme policies, when Bush enacted them, became, with Obama's help, part of the bipartisan consensus of American foreign policy. As Der Spiegel wrote, today, Obama's CIA no longer carries out kidnappings, it carries out killings. This means the CIA can assume a military role and wage a war unconstrained by international law or the laws of war. Obama's CIA decides who lives and who dies.